This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we apply our patent-pending Stanley rubric to the movie that made James Cameron's career, The Terminator, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Michael Biehn, and Linda Hamilton. However, quickly before we get to the show, next week we will be covering our first holiday movie of the year and my personal favorite holiday movie, Love Actually, starring Liam Neeson, Hugh Grant, Colin Firth, Keira Knightley, Emma Thompson, Alan Rickman, and Bill Nye, and there are people I left off that list. You won't want to miss that one, so please watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Also, you can now sign up for our weekly newsletter either by the website in the show notes. You can subscribe at the bottom of every page. You can also email us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast, that's one word, at gmail.com. Additionally, did you know that our website has the full notes for every episode of the show, as well as the master list of movies we've graded so far? There are links in the episode descriptions of every episode to direct you right there, so check them out. And, as always, please, for us, like, follow, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you use. We would really appreciate it. All right, Dad, so, The Terminator. Another science fiction classic in a genre you could not care less about and would have almost no interest in watching if it wasn't for the podcast. So I'm not even going to bother to ask you because this isn't necessarily the same class of movie, in my opinion, as The Matrix. I think it's held in somewhat the same category or same sphere, maybe esteem is the right word for it, by some people, not me, but some people. And while I know that normally this isn't going to be your movie, let me divert this slightly and say, what do you remember about this movie in relation to 80s culture that you grew up in?
1983, correct?
84.
84. Okay.
So you would have been in college. This would have been what, first year at Beloit?
Second. I would have been a sophomore. First year at Beloit. I went somewhere else my freshman year.
That's what I said.
Yeah, so first year at Beloit, second year of college. All right? What I remember about this film is the following. I used to religiously watch Siskel and Ebert and follow whatever they said. And when they did the review of this film, neither of them could stand the film. They both said it was not that good. It was lacking really it had a plot, but it didn't make a lot of sense. There were holes, whatever. But they kept going over and over again. Oh my God, this Arnold Schwarzenegger. This guy is really good. And he has such a screen presence. And they just kept commenting about how this guy is going to be a big movie star yet, because of his ability to really take over a scene on script or on the screen. And that's what I remember. And I remember going, oh, here's a film that I don't think I need to go and see. In fact, this kind of looks like something I would not enjoy, nor do I think this is a film that I think is going to be very good. And so for 40 years, almost 40 years, I have avoided watching it. Now I've watched it, and my original assessment from 1984 was correct.
Well, at least you kind of linked into what my next question was going to be. But just before I get to that, was this before or after Siskel and Ebert were national? Because, I mean, living out of Beloit, you probably would have gotten the regional coverage from Chicago.
I can't remember. I think they were national at this point in time. I think they started in the late 70s. On public TV out of Chicago and were picked up by Wisconsin Public TV. But I think they went national because this is about the same time that Michael Jordan would have become really a star and the Bulls would have taken off. And Gene Siskel played his national prominence into getting front court seats at the Chicago Bulls games. And so every time he'd watch a Bulls game, Gene Siskel would be sitting in the front row, usually with a different girl every night.
Well, good for him. I mean, if you got it, why not use it? The other question that I had was, is Arnold Schwarzenegger the or cinema's greatest action hero? Now, you got to stack up his movies. You got Commando, you've got Conan, you've got the two Terminator movies, you've got The Predator, you've got True Lies, and what's Total Recall. So I think he's at least in the running. You might make an argument for Sylvester Stallone.
Oh no. I've seen the Rambo, or I saw Rambo or First Blood, and I saw First Blood 2 Rambo. That was where I stopped after that because, yeah, no.
Yeah, but Stallone had other action movies that he was a part of and other action franchises.
Okay, I understand, but I would say Schwarzenegger is at least in in the top three overall. I'd have to stop and think about who what else would be in it, but actually, I think Schwarzenegger's best films are his comedies. I really like Kindergarten Cop, and I love Twins. I think both of those films are hilarious.
I don't think I've ever seen Twins, but I'm sure we'll get around to it at some point. Kindergarten Cop, I don't know whether that'll come up or not on the show, but we've done worse films.
Well, and then of course we also have Jingle All the Way, where he and Sinbad are chasing all each other all over the city looking for a toy. And
But you forgot the great Phil Hartman.
oh yes, yes. So
I don't know. I think that arguably, and I don't think anybody thinks of them that way because the action film, quote unquote, wasn't until maybe the 80s. But I think that the greatest action hero of cinema, at least the golden period, is probably John Wayne.
okay,
I just find that it's pretty easy to put Arnold in that next category and the guy that ruled for probably 15 years at least the action scene from the mid 80s to basically the back half of the 90s.
you could say that, but you could add various actors to the action star. You could add in Steve McQueen because he was in several racing films. He was in the Great Escape. He's on the motorcycle. You could add in Errol Flynn because he did the Robin Hood films, which were chase sequences. It's just a matter of how you define what is or is not an action film. And as time has gone by and as tastes have changed, we've required more and more action, more and more stunts, more and more car chases, more and more dangerous action. And that's why I think it's harder to compare the different eras because the expectations are different.
All fair points. So I don't really have much of a relationship to this movie. I think I watched this for the first time maybe in the last 5 years or something, and I ended up watching T2 right after it. And really, the point of watching this movie is for the significance it holds for its two main stars, both Schwarzenegger and James Cameron, but also because it sets up our ability to do T2, which I think by most people's account is the far superior film. And I think it is much better made. It's quite clear to me that Cameron didn't have the full budget that he wanted, or that he hadn't become the master filmmaker that I would argue he already got to by the time he made Aliens.
I hope so. I haven't seen T2, and I think maybe I've seen pieces of it at one point in time in passing. And if it's what I'm thinking, yeah, I could see where it would be a better film.
Well, I think it's the one that basically has spurned on the franchise, kind of like what Aliens did for the Alien franchise, that they've had like four more of them. They've had four more Terminator movies just on the basis of maybe one of them will turn out to be somewhat like even 50% of what T2 was when it came out in 91.
Well, we could always wait. I mean, Schwarzenegger's what, 71, 72? We
But
could
he's been in
almost.
the last few of them.
He could do another one where he's frozen like the Tin Man, and somebody comes out with a can of oil.
Wow, are you stretching on this?
Uh,
Do you have our plot summary ready?
I do. Two time travelers from the future arrive in Los Angeles in 1984. One is a cyborg, Arnold Schwarzenegger, sent to hunt and terminate Sarah Connor, Linda Hamilton, and the other is a resistance soldier, Michael Biehn, sent to protect her. Connor is the future mother of John Connor, a revolutionary leader from the future. If Sarah Connor is killed, then John Connor will never lead the resistance over the machines. Will the cyborg terminate his mark?
Thank you. Cast for this movie: Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator, Michael Biehn as Kyle Reese, Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor, Paul Winfield as Ed Traxler, Lance Henriksen as Vukovic, Bess Mata as Ginger, Rick Rossovich as Matt, and finally Earl Bowen as Dr. Silberman. Recognition for this movie: The Terminator topped the United States box office for 2 weeks, eventually grossing $78.3 million against a modest $6.4 million budget. It is credited with launching Cameron's film career and solidifying Schwarzenegger's status as a leading man. The film's success led to a franchise consisting of several sequels, a television series, comic books, novels, and video games. The film has received recognition from the American Film Institute as it was ranked 42nd on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Thrills. The character of the Terminator was selected as the 22nd greatest movie villain on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Heroes and Villains. Schwarzenegger's catchphrase, "I'll be back," was also voted 37th greatest movie quote. In 2005, Total Film named it the 72nd best film ever made. In 2008, Empire selected The Terminator as one of the 500 greatest movies of all time. Empire also placed the T-800 14th on their list of 100 greatest movie characters. In 2010, the Independent Film and Television Alliance selected the film as one of the 30 most significant independent films of the last 30 years. In 2015, The Terminator was among the films included in the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. In 2008, The Terminator was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry. Did you know? While shooting this film, James Cameron often resorted to what he called guerrilla filmmaking as a way of getting around acquiring permits needed to film certain scenes. This involved the production crew and actors quickly arriving at a specified location, shooting the scene, and leaving before the police arrived. As a result, some of the people seen in a few shots are actually everyday citizens completely unaware they're in a movie. This was also used for reshoots, with Cameron even calling and waking Arnold Schwarzenegger once at 3 a.m. to meet him at a location already in full costume to quickly reshoot a scene. Cameron also used this tactic to film the very last scene where Sarah drives off into the desert. This almost backfired, however, when the police came sniffing around. Did you know? O.J. Simpson was considered for the Terminator, but the producers feared he was too nice to be taken seriously as a cold-blooded killer. I
Yeah.
figured you'd enjoy that one. Did you know? Arnold Schwarzenegger worked with guns every day for a month to prepare for the role. The first 2 weeks of filming, he practiced weapon stripping and reassembly blindfolded until the motions were automatic, like a machine. He spent hours at the shooting range and practicing with different weapons without blinking or looking at them when reloading or cocking. He also had to be ambidextrous. He practiced different moves up to 50 times. He wound up garnering a compliment in Soldier of Fortune magazine for his realistic handling of the guns on camera, whereas the magazine usually lampoons movies for their inaccurate depictions of weapons use. Did you know? The beginning of production was postponed for 9 months due to Arnold Schwarzenegger's commitment to Conan the Destroyer. During this time, James Cameron wanted to be working but didn't have the time to do a whole other film. He had a talk with some producers at 20th Century Fox who liked his screenplay for Terminator and gave him a writing assignment. This turned out to be Aliens. On the same day, he was also asked to write a script for Rambo First Blood Part 2. While handling these two assignments, he also did additional work on his Terminator screenplay, writing each script at night at a different desk in order to keep the projects apart. All right, let's take a quick break and we will be right back. All right, Dad, what is this movie about, or what would be the elevator pitch?
Time travelers attempt to protect or alter history.
Yeah, this is kind of a reversal of fortune. I'm going to cheat a little bit. At some point, read what the actual pitch for this movie or what the concept of it was. So I kind of already have that answer, but a cyborg from the future plays the role of Michael Myers.
Okay.
Basically, that the Terminator is a horror movie villain that can never be killed, and no matter how many times you think you have him dead, eventually he just keeps coming and coming until that final moment of the film. So, best performance for you?
Wow. The acting was so stellar. It was really difficult to choose between all of the great acting parts. So I went with the one that had the most range. I went with with Linda. I went with Linda Hamilton because at least she had to actually say some lines and show some emotion.
Yeah, I guess Michael Biehn really was one tone throughout the whole movie. Again, this was a low budget film, and none of these people were fairly well known and really haven't been known since this movie, except for this franchise, with the exception being Arnold. So that's actually why I went with him as my best performance. And I think it's distinctly because of one thing. They actually attempted to give him less lines in this movie than Conan the Barbarian. He had 24 lines in Conan the Barbarian that he had to memorize. He only had 14 for this movie. So if you can have Arnold looking cool, doing a whole bunch of stunt work, and not having to talk, I think it's a better movie. And so for that, I'm going to give him my best performance.
So, in other words, you're giving credit to a silent film.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay,
realistically,
I'll
you could
remember
have gone
that.
for him as most charismatic, but he just looked cool. He looked menacing. He handled himself very well. We gave him credit for the fact that he handled the weaponry with accuracy, at least to how it's supposed to be used. He rode a motorcycle, he did a whole bunch of random stunts, and he came off the best as far as star quality from this movie.
I agree. I mean, he was the one star in a constellation of crap.
You're going to reuse that one, aren't you?
I like that.
Yeah, okay. My best secondary performer was James Cameron, only because of the lengths that he had to go in order to get this thing made and how far he's really come since then. Even in making the sequel, I think that for a time, just about every movie that Jim Cameron made from about the mid 80s through about the basically Titanic, with the exception of Into the Abyss, was like a huge movie comparatively to just the normal box office. He had hit after hit after hit of major movies that way overproduced what people thought that they were going to do and had such a reverence in the industry as a result of it. But part of this was is he had to sell this movie for $1 to the producers at a particular small studio and get this thing off the ground. This was not necessarily a big budget film. It was something he wrote, he conceptualized. He had done some very small budget films, but the whole point of selling the script for $1 was he pushed to get himself installed as the director and keep his vision. I don't think you have quite the level of complication that you would in now today with basically everybody filming on an iPhone camera that you did in the 80s. And so this wouldn't necessarily be a thing, but how many guys have we not seen pushed to basically start their own career and were obstinate and persistent beyond a doubt to basically get their careers? Stallone did the same thing with Rocky, and we are all the better for it, I think, personally. I think the movies would actually be, despite my feelings on Rambo, would be less of a place without Sylvester Stallone and the presence that he's given us over a lot of years. I'll give it to James Cameron as my best secondary. Who was yours?
I had Cameron, and interesting. I'm kind of curious because Cameron just did a master's class on master class environment, which I have a membership, and I think I'm going to actually watch his master class just to see how he talks about the aliens in film and then the Terminator films. But I think for the most part, he did I think, a pretty good job of making a cohesive film. There are lots of problems with the film, but still, I think he made it for just over $6 million.
Yes, 6.4.
So I think he did a very credible job with a small budget and a bunch of no names trying to do to make a film that ended up, what was it? I think it was,
So when I read it for the did you know or the recognition portion, it was 78 point something $1 million compared to a $6.4 million budget. So that's 12 times over.
yeah. So I think that's pretty good as far as hitting on something that resonated with the public.
All right, most charismatic for you.
Arnold. I mean, I agreed with Siskel and Ebert. He did have a quality. See, and actually, before the films, I knew who Arnold Schwarzenegger was because I watched a piece, and I want to say it was on 60 Minutes, where they were discussing men's bodybuilding, and Arnold was like the king of men's bodybuilding at that time. And just like amazed as to how these guys looked and what kind of effort it took to build themselves in that way. At the time, being naive, not knowing that there was probably a few performance enhancing drugs used to get him that way. But still, so I was aware of that, and he just had a presence, and I think that was part of the whole thing with the bodybuilding. It was the way you presented yourself and the charisma you uh, or exuded, the charisma you exuded in that presentation that had as much to do with winning as what your muscles looked like. I always thought he had certain charms and such, and with the accent only furthers that charm or charisma because there's a certain mystery to it.
I suppose you're correct. And like I said, I could have probably gone, and maybe it was a more accurate description to put him in my most charismatic, but I had a hard time, like you, picking best performance. But I ended up going with my most compelling character in the movie. Personally, I don't think much of Linda Hamilton in this movie, or just period. I don't think she's particularly gifted as an actor, and that's borne out over the many sequels to this movie, where I just think at this point she just becomes this unusually tough woman that her only role is to basically look good with a gun. That being
uh,
said, I went with Michael Biehn. I don't think he appears in any of the sequels that I've seen of the Terminator franchise. And realistically, I've only seen him in two movies, this one and in Aliens. And both times I thought he was effective. I thought he was believable without necessarily being over the top. I was compelled by his character and his desire to save the future. And I don't know, there's just some quality about him that I can't necessarily put my finger on. But every time I watch the movie, I watch it partly because of him.
okay,
Maybe it's more that I relate more to his mission of saving Linda Hamilton than actually caring about whether they save Linda Hamilton.
I know. At some point in time, I actually think it would be interesting to do a spoof of it where he comes back and sees Linda Hamilton and goes, I'm supposed to save you? Nah, and leaves. Uh,
Save it for your Croc movie.
yep.
That and Thunder Lube. All right, best scene then. I only have six down, and I kind of stretched it just to get to six. The opening with Arnold and Michael Biehn basically coming back in time and both showing up naked and having to basically assault different people on the street in order to get clothes.
Yes. Did
And
you happen,
I'll
by the way, to see the cameo of probably his first film?
well, it's one of the great trivia questions that we asked during the Aliens podcast. Is Bill Paxton? He's been killed by a predator, a Terminator, and an alien.
But didn't quite die as a result of an asteroid.
I guess so. But I'll put in the opening not because of them showing up naked and Arnold having an unusually sculpted body, but more or less, I actually like the sequencing of Reese running through the department store and trying to escape and
Yes.
going out of his way on that one. So I just liked how that kind of showed up. Then Reese saves Sarah at the discotheque. We're already skipping a bunch of non consequential scenes that really had some of the worst acting and 80s haircuts and clothes that I think I've ever seen in a movie. I mean, God, how did you guys get away with all of that shit? Regardless, the that's the first big action sequence where you kind of get the idea. Although, yes, Arnold does kill another Sarah Connor before that, but most of that's just set up to get to that point, and that's where the rising and falling action of this movie starts, where you kind of really get the ball rolling. So that was another one for me. Finally, when we get to the "Is Reese crazy" scene with him and the doctor, and Vukovic constantly, oh, you got to hear this part, and they're all just sitting around the police table watching the tape. I don't know. I thought that was cinematic and it worked pretty well, all things considered, because if anybody showed up in our timeline and just started saying, oh, well, your son that's not yet born and that you haven't even conceived of yet, because lo and behold, James Cameron leaves a voicemail on your answering machine that says he can't go out with you that day. But sure, let's say that you're the mother of the resistance leader that will save mankind from Skynet. Yeah, how is that not crazy?
Yeah.
The "I'll be back." I forgot that that was from this movie because there are more of the iconic lines for Arnold are actually in T2, but just the way that that played out and then him driving through the front of the police station and basically just mowing down all of these cops I thought was probably one of the better parts of the movie. And then finally, the final chase sequence. So through the trucks with him on the motorcycle, then through the, I don't know what kind of factory, what that was exactly. It looked like a bottling plant for a little while, but what bottling plant has like a major press like that would end up
Hydraulic press,
smashing?
yeah.
So I don't know exactly what plant it was, but yeah,
I don't
basically
either.
from the point where the Terminator catches them on the motorcycle up through the point where she ends the Terminator. I'll go with that as the final scene. So any of the ones that I missed that you care to nominate?
No, I think you more than liberally covered the best scenes. The only thing I can say is the factory. You know, Hitchcock always used the MacGuffin, and in this case, the factory is what you could call it, the MacGyver. It didn't matter what it actually was. It's just about the technology to destroy things.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna get to some parts of that in my remaining questions. So, but let's move forward. Favorite scene for me was "I'll be back." It's also my most indelible. I think that's probably the best scene of this movie, realistically put, where he's completely mowing everybody down. Then Reese has to escape custody. There's the whole, I don't know if it was quite a jump scare, but essentially where Linda Hamilton or Sarah Connor thinks that the Terminator is basically standing over her or has caught her, and it's actually Reese, and they figure out how to escape the police station. I thought it was one of the most effective scenes because it's Arnold versus all of the cops. There's literally no dialogue whatsoever. And all of these stupid cops that really can't understand anything or aren't willing to believe that, there's some possibility of what was going on and that he wasn't crazy are just completely shot to hell. And Arnold mows them down like they're nothing. So, favorite scene for you?
That scene as well, because otherwise I wouldn't have one.
Okay, most indelible.
Same thing, because again, other than that scene, so much of this film is forgettable.
All right. I have a feeling where we're going to end up with your scores here by the end of this, but this seems like a good time to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. All right, before we get to the very few best lines of this movie, in memoriam this week, Dad, do we have anybody to remember?
We have several. They're not well known names, but different areas of the film and entertainment community. Lou Cuttle was an actor, was in Pee Wee's Big Adventure, Betty White's Off Their Rocker, and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Joey Morgan was an actor, Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse, Critters, A New Binge, and Flower. Scott Robb, or Robbie, he was a television and film producer. He Seven and a Match and Queer Eye. Will Ryan was an American voice actor who did The Land Before Time, was in Little Mermaid and An American Tale. And Art LaFleur, American actor, Field of Dreams, The Sandlot, and The Santa Claus.
Two.
Two, excuse me.
Yeah, the only one off of this list that I had a strong connection to was Art LaFleur. He was in a lot of sports movies and kids movies and had a lot of recurring roles where he was kind of a that guy. I honestly can't I don't think I knew his name until he passed away this week. But the minute I saw his face, I'm like, oh yeah, oh that's too bad because I loved him in a lot of these movies. He was kind of a strong disciplinarian dad type. And he ended up playing those roles quite often through a lot of these films. I know he was Babe Ruth in The Sandlot, and I think that would be a role that a lot of kids my age would know him from. But he was also, I think, one of the primary elves in Santa's Workshop in the Santa Claus 2. And so there's a lot of different small roles that I'm sure people would resonate with him. I can't say that I know a lot of the other ones, but Joey Morgan passing away at 28. Gosh, that's young.
Yes, very unfortunate.
So we take a moment here of silence for all of these fallen actors to remember their great contributions. Thank you. All right, the very few, I think this one might be some of the fewest, best lines, funniest lines I've ever come up with. But first one up for me, fuck you, asshole.
Ah, you took mine.
That was the only one you had?
Well, no, but that was the one. I mean, there aren't any lines other than "I'll be back" that are worth repeating. So I was just going to use the ones that had the most foul language, so I could just say it.
It's not like you didn't say that to me last night.
Yeah, after you beat me by .2 points in fantasy.
Brady would have needed to throw for 5 more yards. A quick slant pass.
Oh god. Yeah, all
It's the
right.
difference
Anyway.
between me winning my division right now and not.
Yeah. Oh well. Anyway,
So you're gonna take one of the other ones here?
all right. Oh, what have you got? Mothballs, corn syrup, and ammonia. I
That's one
didn't.
of your best lines?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because I had no idea how you go about making explosives.
Alright. There are 3 decent lines in this movie, and I think that's about it. And I'll get to another story here in a second, but it is fuck you, asshole. I'll be back, and come with me if you want to live. That's it.
Well, I like the derelicts line because it can be used so many different ways. Some good, some bad. You know, it's kind of like George Carlin in the 7 Things You Can't Say on Television. That son of a bitch took my pants. That could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing.
Hmm. Yes, I'm sure it could be a good and a bad thing, depending on whether some derelict in an alley says it or Rodney Dangerfield,
Well, or your mother calls you a son of a bitch.
as that's happened a few different times.
Yeah.
Oh well. She's at least not here to defend herself on this one. All right, so are we ready to call it on best funniest lines, or do you have
Oh,
any
yes,
other?
please. Let's move on.
All right, so Stanley Rubric then. Legacy's up first. Do you want to lambaste this first or second?
Well, okay. I will tell you right up front. It's good and steadily decreases significantly. Okay, from a legacy or the industry. I think this had a huge impact on films and sci-fi and the whole concept, the concepts that were used throughout the later 80s, the 90s, into the early 21st century. So I'm going to give it for the industry a 5. For the public, I think people still know more about this film without having probably ever seen it or only seen it once or twice yet to this day. I mean, if how many times do you hear the or thing where somebody will quote, "I'll be back." So I went only because there's a small decline in the significance of the movie over the last 10 years. So I wanted the 4.5. So I'm going to give it Legacy a 9.5.
Okay, so we're already splitting some categories on this one. I'm rather shocked that you even went in that route. For me, it was a 3.5 for the industry because the special effects in this, because of the low budget nature, really didn't have nearly the same effect that something like T2 did when they did a lot more with CGI. So I thought once James Cameron was actually given more carte blanche to do some different things, that's where he really made his bones. And the biggest legacy from an industry standpoint are all right, this legitimately makes Arnold a bankable star, which he utilizes to then do Commando and then do several other big movies right after this. Then I think about his peak is the sequel, and it raises the stature of James Cameron and puts him in a position to do Aliens. And once he's done Aliens, now his career takes off as well. The problem for me is Arnold hasn't done a big movie where he's been a star since Batman and Robin. That was 1998. And
Yes.
that movie was terrible. Now, his biggest thing is he involved in some weird sex lawsuit with his maid, or is he making anti fascist videos about Trump and posting them on the internet? He is a complete has been. And James Cameron has made exactly one movie since 1997. Otherwise, he's fishing the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Now, he's supposedly making Avatar sequels because the one movie he made that was since 1997 happens to be the biggest movie of all time. But I don't know how many people really care about seeing Avatar 2 until basically we have to.
And that will be a big step for me because I've yet to see Avatar 1.
Well, there's something about visual storytelling that James Cameron's really good at. As far as the actual story being told, though, not so much.
Yeah.
So for me, this was a 3.5 in the industry. For the audience standpoint, I thought this did well, but it wasn't necessarily like a huge movie. And again, I compare it to Terminator 2 Judgment Day. That is the more significant film. That's the one that people quote more often. The Hasta la Vista Baby is from that one. There are a lot more things that people take and love about that movie and compare it to by comparison to this one, which was low budget, and I think people will occasionally watch it, but there's more reverence for T2 than there is this one. So if this thing has any legacy, it's that they are continuing to make sequels, but I don't think it's on the back of the original being that much better. I think it's on the sequel being more to the liking of what James Cameron's original vision that he would have liked to have done in this film was, but he didn't get the opportunity to make it because A, he didn't have the money, and B, the technology wasn't there yet. So wait 7 years and all of a sudden it'll catch up. So for me, the audience is a 3. I went with a 6.5.
Oh, wow.
Yes, so that's an 8 average between us,
Okay.
which I think is about right, honestly. I was having a hard time coming up. I thought it was probably somewhere closer to the range of a 7, but compared to what some of the other movies we had in that range, I just don't think this is the same staying power as those other ones. On an impact significance range, though, I'll move my industry score just up slightly another one because I think in the short term, you could say Arnold and James Cameron were bigger stars in the next 5 to, I don't know, 7 years after this movie. And this was something that helped spur their career. Again, I don't think this was their peak or that this is the thing that really launched them per se, but this certainly got them going. I think Cameron's crowning achievement, or at least the thing that broke him out as a star director, was Aliens. And for Arnold, I don't think he really got to that point until probably Predator. But you want to say that yes, this was their big collaboration together and they've been friends since, and this franchise has kind of defined how people see them. Sure, I can buy that. So I'll go with a 4 for the industry and 3 again for the audience. Again, this was a fairly popular movie, but it wasn't necessarily like it wasn't like a lot of the other 80s movies that we've covered that had huge tails on them. I mean, what was it, like a year and a half that Raiders was in the theaters? Or I know Home Alone, I guess, was released right into 1990, 1991, but that movie was number one for weeks. We talked about Back to the Future was number one for a long time. There have been a lot of movies that were at number one at the box office for a long period of time. This just wasn't one of them. It was kind of short lived, and it was a decent movie that people liked. And I'm sure that this was part of the VHS craze that eventually got to that point, but it certainly wasn't on the category of some of the great movies of the 80s either. So for me, it's kind of midpoint. I'll go with 3 on that one, 7 overall.
Okay. Impact and significance. For the industry, I went with a 3.5 because I think there were people who really didn't like it. The critics didn't care for it all that much, but they seemed to recreate aspects of it and utilize it as a starting point for other projects. So I went with a little bit there. Mark Twain said a classic book is a book that everyone wants on their shelf but no one ever reads. Having lived through this time frame, there were a lot of people who made a big deal of the Terminator who never saw the film or who only casually watched it. So I think it was a bigger deal within that time frame, having lived through it, than what you see looking back on it. So I went with a 4 on that for 7.5.
All right, so then that's a 7.25 average between us. Novelty. Yes, he had to invent an entire backstory. I think the concept of this was produced in a sense like on several horror films, but wanted to make it more sci-fi thriller. And I guess the club in the movie is tech noir, and that's a phrase he supposedly coined to describe how his movies were supposed to feel. That this is modern noir, kind of in the vein of like a Blade Runner that we're eventually going to get to. That they're a throwback to a certain style of cinema, but didn't necessarily involve going back as a period piece, but updated them to include things like cyborgs. But it's still set in modern day. Now, part of that was due to budget, so I'm not going to necessarily take terribly some points from that, but it just feels derivative. I don't think there's necessarily anything totally unique. You're running from a madman who happens to be a cyborg from the future, and you're just kind of telling a story somewhat in reverse. So I kind of split the difference because, yes, there are some elements of this that I'll give them some credit for, but I didn't think they were necessarily reinventing the wheel. So I went with a 7 on this.
Many of the same points you're making, I have, which is the overall story is not that unique. The way it's packaged is so, but is a present what's contained within it, or is it the wrapping paper on the outside? I had a real problem with this being novel. So I actually ended up thinking seriously about this and coming to a 7. So, do you need help with the math on this?
No.
Okay.
Classicness. You always go first.
Well, again, Denzel in distress, classic 80s situation, which is the traditional roles, nothing unique. Linda Hamilton ultimately, I guess, becomes more aggressive and more of a action hero herself in the later films, from what I can remember, bits and pieces of what I've seen. So I take something away from that. From the classicness, the special effects, oh my God, are they bad? I mean, the way the cyborg moves, it's like I think that you'd be better off with stop action film from the Raskin and whatever the guys that did the claymation Santa Claus is coming to town type of thing back in the 60s. That's about what it was. And so I can't give it any points for the special effects. It's cheesy. The scene where Arnold is trying to open up his hand to fix himself in his eye. I mean, the part where he's like cutting into his eye, that is so bad. It is so much where you're looking at it and going, "Oh, that's just a rubber mask." That it defies. It's almost insulting to your intelligence. I mean, at the time, maybe it would have been much more realistic because special effects weren't that prevalent. But from a classics point of view, I can't go any higher than a 4.
Okay. So you hit a lot of the same points that I was going to make. I start at normally my 7 and work either upward or backward. The special effects in this truly are abysmal. Supposedly, it took 6 months to make that, I don't know, rubber mask you called it, where he's dissecting his eye and that whole, and it looks terrible. I mean, I got on the Raiders of the Lost Ark and the melting faces for how bad that looks in hindsight now, and this looks 10 times worse than that. I don't know what the hell they're doing, but somebody needs to almost like remaster that because it just looks awful.
Yeah.
Just truly awful. The musical score is so terrible. 80s. It's like somebody decided they were going to play a guitar through the entire freaking movie, and I just can't stand it. Oh, it was bad. The clothes, the hair, and all of the taste of the 80s are displayed in this movie, and they died out in the 80s, and that's where they should stay. Good God.
Was there taste in the 80s? I can't remember any.
My point exactly.
And I lived it.
And I think that it's also not very classic from this standpoint, too. No one in this movie or this franchise has survived outside of this franchise, save for Arnold and James Cameron. And they never show up. Like literally, Linda Hamilton has probably made an entire career out of being Sarah Connor, and that's it. Because I've never seen her do anything else other than she briefly was married to James Cameron. But then again, so is half of Hollywood. I think he's been married 6 times. So all of these add up to individual points off for me. I ended up also at a 4.
Ooh, do you need help with the math?
No.
Okay.
Fuck you, asshole.
Okay.
Rewatchability. I was bored a lot during this movie.
Oh god, so much. I had to take a break. I went over and started just going, oh my god, am I going to have fun just ripping this film?
Okay, so I know how good or how rewatchable a film is to me by how quickly it takes for me to touch my phone. And I think I made it 10 minutes before I started touching my phone on and off. Like, I half heartedly watched this movie. It's not the action drive that you get from a lot of other great action movies. I think this is notable for a lot of reasons that we've already stated, and so that's why it's going to remain classic. But I don't think individually this movie is like one of the great all-time action movies either. I think its reverence comes from who's associated with it and the franchise overall, but I think more of that has to piggyback on the fact that the sequel is probably one of the greatest sequels and action movies ever. we'll eventually get to that one, but for a 105-minute movie, God, I think I was in and out of this movie probably like a dozen times. And it shouldn't be this slow between action sequences. It just shouldn't. I just could never easily, or excuse me, I could just as easily never see this film again and I'd be okay. If I have to watch it, fine, but there's almost no point in me going back and watching this film ever again, in my opinion. So I ended at a 3.
I actually came up with the exact same number. You know, we oftentimes equate things as being better or worse than a root canal. I have had a root canal. The root canal was better because they froze my face so I didn't feel anything. I felt tortured sitting through this at times where I'm going, oh my God, is this going to end? How much time? I think and that's my measure, is when I hit the button on the remote to see how much time is left in the film, going, oh my God, I think I hit it 4 times, and that's even stopping twice. I stopped once to go and get a refill of my drink, and then I stopped at once to go over and talk to your mother and go, I didn't like this or didn't want to see this film 40 years ago, and I know exactly why, because everything I thought about the film then is now established as true. So I went with a 3 because, we're talking about 2 being some of the more horrible films on my list of all time, and below that. So I gave it a 3 for that reason.
All right. So just to recap and add this all up, audience score, we had a 93 for Google users, we had an 89 for Rotten Tomato users for a 9.1. But
Wow.
our scores, legacy 8, impact significance 7.25, novelty 7, classicness 4, rewatchability 3, and audience score 9.1 for a 38.35 total, which would currently place it in between Mr. Roberts and Idiocracy on the list.
That might be too high.
You can't argue with some of the legacy and impact of this
I
movie
know.
and some of the people associated with it.
Ugh.
That's the only thing propping it up, that and the audience score being its highest number. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's not. This is like maybe one of those nostalgia movies that a lot of people have reverence for in memory more than like the same way people view Top Gun and you and I can't stand it.
Kind of like how when I was, like 11, 12 years old and Saturday Night Live came on, and I thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen, and was ranting and raving in school on Monday about this show. And I watched it from the very beginning, watched the first episode with George Carlin and thought this was hilarious and then I went back and rented the tapes or rented it and started watching from the first season. And I'm going, oh my God, is this terrible? Because at the time it was great because it was fresh and different. Now you look at it and go, wow, this was really terrible.
Which is a credit to how well the Eddie Murphy sketches have aged. Because
Yes,
those are actually still funny.
there were a few that were classics that survived, that were from the early days of Saturday Night Live, that were funny. The Dan Aykroyd as Julia Child bleeding all over the kitchen will always hold a special place in my memory.
Apparently, that and Coneheads.
Yes, and then he and Steve Martin, 2 wild and crazy guys.
And it also doesn't resist your urge to eventually, at some point, call me every time we get together an ignorant slut.
Yes, weekend update. Jane, you ignorant slut.
Between that and Francisco Franco is still dead. There are moments.
Yes, I know. And again, the joke is that the joke is so bad and consistently bad that that's the funny part, is people groan. Hey, Tom, do you have Wisconsin?
Do you need help with the math on that?
Yeah. Uh, I needed a good laugh after this last week.
All right, remaining questions. Do you have any?
Yes, there are so many plot holes in this film. I just want to say, what the fuck? I can't in a million years list them all.
I don't think there are quite that many, but
I think I lost track at like 11, where I'm going, huh?
I don't remember it being quite that bad, but I have at least two. What metal substance can withstand that ridiculous an amount of explosions and keep going? I seriously, I've thought that about Iron Man. I'm like, how do you create such an indestructible metal that it can't be penetrated by bullets? I mean, at least in the first one, they're like, oh, are those bullet holes? But even after that, it's what substance on Earth, unless you literally create a comic book substance called vibranium that you have to invent from another element that's not currently on the periodic table, is impenetrable to literally sticking a pipe bomb inside of it. Anyway, number two, and this was the stereotypical part of the movie where you're starting to like yell at the movie screen because they're being so stupid. The fucking T-800 is limping and able to move at a snail's pace. Why don't you just run? You've been running the whole fucking movie. I know you're dragging Reese and he just sits there for the pipe bomb, but like, how is it that both of you aren't at least more capable than this cyborg who's basically limping like he's Igor and run away from him? Really?
Well, Igor had a hump, so maybe that's the difference.
What hump?
Did I set that one up?
Anyway, all right. Any final thoughts on the movie?
I don't care if I ever see it again. Yeah, that's my final thoughts on the movie.
So we still have several James Cameron movies to get to,
Oh god.
including the sequel.
Yeah, all right, that's fun.
So more or less, looking forward to less, Avatar or T2?
Oh, Avatar by far. At least T2 supposedly has some decent action and such. I mean, who wants to see fucking blue people? If I want to see blue people, I'll go watch the La Poofies, the Smurfs.
Okay, that the Italian word for the Smurfs is the Ipufi,
E Poofy, yeah.
which is just funny by itself.
Well,
Final thoughts for the week.
in a few days, I will turn 1 year older, I guess. So I look back on my life, and I honestly, other than my profession and my family, I'm trying to think of what things, sports and movies probably have had the two biggest impacts on my life up till now. I've enjoyed both, and it's made the ride much more enjoyable as a result.
Certainly, you've passed down those passions, as I'm sure your dad somewhat did to you, and thus why it's Ronnie Duncan Studios.
Yes. And as far as sports goes, the number of Sundays where my dad picked up a pop bottle and threatened to throw it at the TV when Favre threw an interception are beyond counting.
Well, there also were a lot of Favre interceptions, so I mean, he
Yeah.
still holds the record for most interceptions, and I don't think that will ever be touched. All right, so this will conclude episode 93. We have 3 holiday episodes to look forward to, including a guest in a couple of weeks that's been on the show a few times so far, and we get to settle one of the great family debates we've ever had. But until then, well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us. And the microphones. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week, we will be covering our first holiday movie of the year and my personal favorite holiday movie, Love Actually, starring Liam Neeson, Hugh Grant, Colin Firth, Keira Knightley, Emma Thompson, Alan Rickman, and Bill Nye. You won't want to miss that one, so please watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's ReelGood. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com, find us on Instagram at GMotePodcast, or find us on Twitter at GMotePodcast. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.